Hi everyone, welcome to the session. I'm going to just run you all through very quickly the housekeeping rules for today. So the chat window is disabled and it will be so for the next 20 minutes. After which you can all post your questions there. And if you have any questions in the meanwhile, you can also tweet them at the intersection handle and we'll take them in. Requesting everyone to keep your audio and video switched off throughout the session as well.
We could start now, Madhuri, with
All right.
recording.
Okay.
Anyway. Yeah.
Thanks, Arjun. So it is my extreme pleasure to welcome Dr. Chinmay Tumbe from IIM Ahmedabad for the talk with us today. Professor Tumbe is an assistant professor at IIM-A in the area of economics and has been working in the domain of migration, so to say, for the past decade. He served on multiple policy-making groups in the country and abroad, and is recently been more acclaimed for his well-known book, India Moving, A History of Migration. So there are topics in that, some of which we touch upon today as well. So Professor Tumbe, thank you so much for making time and being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So to get us started, I think, would you like to throw some light upon the current migrant crisis? We've all seen it, we've heard enough of it, we've seen a lot of media coverage. But so I get more specifically into the heart of the matter of what areas and issues within that do you think that could have been done differently? What policy decisions, what administrative decisions that have led it to being a crisis even in a pandemic situation? So what do you think could have been done differently, and your thoughts around?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, you rightly pointed out migrant crisis, but you have to talk it in the present tense because a lot of people think it's over, but it's still ongoing. I mean, there are literally, I would say, almost 20 to 30 million people right now sitting in the villages with absolutely no work and waiting to come back to cities, really. So it's so just because we can't see it, it doesn't mean that the crisis is over. And in a way, when we saw it first, it was very, very stark. I'll just give you an example of what happened 100 years back. One of the things I do is also history. I teach history. During the plague, in 1896, when it struck Bombay, the British had a very interesting dilemma, whether to shut the railways or not. And very interestingly, the British did a lot of mistakes back then while handling plague. But very interestingly, they came to this conclusion that we should not shut down the railways for two reasons. One, because it will cause hardship and inconvenience. This is the British in 1896. And the second being that it won't matter if we shut down the railways because people will anyway go back home from some means or the other. And what they could see back then, which we should have been able to see now, is that for the circular migrant worker in India, who is a dominant migrant worker, going back home has two reasons. There's an economic imperative, or let's just say that the minute your income dries up in the city, you become very vulnerable. And so, you want to have this comfort of your family and so on. And second, as they were hearing in the Bombay railway station in 1896-97, this saying that, marna hai to gaon mein marenge. So this is a cultural imperative that, if in a health crisis, if there's something coming from outside, if there's the threat of death, then there is a very strong cultural attachment in India to die in one's village, right? And so there are two factors that really drive this. And the British were right because the people they in fact the British organized special trains, and this took migrants back. Of course, they made a mess out of the overall plague operations. Cut to today, and we had to take a very important decision in March whether to shut down the railways or not, because ultimately this migration crisis revolved around one thing, that is the transport crisis. That is, if the transport options were open for at least a few days, people could have gone back. So very quickly put, it was a clear mistake for many reasons. And in a way, it was kind of admitted by the government in the month of May when they actually opened the railways. Right? So when they anyway opened the railways, at a time when infection rates were much higher, it kind of, in any case, did not go well with the earlier provision. The whole rationale of not letting migrants go was because it will spread the disease. Now, from a public health risk perspective, there is of course a valid case to be made to shut down the railways, to stop transport activity. But the point, so nobody is arguing about shutting down, but the question is about how and when. And that, I believe, was done very badly. We had almost a 10-day window between March 15th. I remember our university campus shut down pretty much on March 15th. Students were asked to leave and so on. And March 24th, which was the final lockdown, we got 4 days notice to bang the plates on our balconies, but the migrant workers got a 4-hour notice. At 8 o'clock, the lockdown speech happened. So clearly there was absolutely no planning on migrants, which is surprising because the government itself had come out with 2 reports. I was associated with both 2016 and 17 on quantifying the scale of migration, showing it's very large, and the lack of portable social security, which is critical out here. So what we saw was a very classic response. And I wrote, a lot of us wrote pieces. I wrote a piece on March 26 in the Hindustan Times saying that let them go back, because for the simple reason that we simply don't have the holding capacity to engage with migrant workers, for long periods. On hindsight now, it's very clear that there are at least 3 or 4 good reasons why in a future crisis we should let migrants go. Notwithstanding the real threat that the disease does spread. There's absolutely no doubt that the disease can spread back through migrants. One is the time inconsistency problem. That is, you simply don't know how long this lockdown is going to last. Note, when the government started, it's a 3-week lockdown, like a Mahabharat war. And in the first few days, in fact, the government said that there were rumors that it would be extended. They said, no, nothing doing. It's going to be only 3 weeks. And then it got extended. And that's really when the migrant crisis intensified. Because when you can't see how long you're in this state, that credibility kind of completely vanished. And that's really when people started. So that's one, that it's impossible to foresee how long the lockdown. So it's better to let people go home up front itself. 2, this thing that the British saw, that anyway people want to go back. Right? So even if you pull out all stops to satisfy the needs of migrant workers in cities, a lot of them will still want to go back. It's just a psychological impact. And 3, there's a really good economic logic. What we saw this year was that migrants went back at the end of the lockdown, when precisely in a way they were needed to get the economy strong. Because we know that a lockdown is important to contain a public health crisis to some extent. We know that it will lead to a massive economic contraction. And so smart economic thinking also demands that you get a turnaround, which means you don't want to delay the economic recovery. So if the migrants had gone back home in March, many of them would have started coming back at the end of May. Instead, what we saw is migrants going back at the end of May. So we, in a way, it's not only about the inconvenience of migrant workers, and many of them had to die, unfortunately die walking back home, but it's also that we've delayed the economic recovery. So on a variety of grounds, I think, completely failed. And the answer is, on hindsight, it's very simple. In this particular case, there was simply no evidence that the virus had spread enough in the country. The government gave a number saying 1/3 of the migrants could have been infected. There was a petition in the Supreme Court, and this is what the government said. And that was a complete lie. In mid-March, there was no way that 1/3 of the migrants, we're talking on millions of, even today, we don't know that, millions of people are infected. So I think they went overboard with this idea that, the disease could be spread at a time when clearly there was not enough evidence of that happening. Suppose even if they had done this decision of a quick lockdown, shut down the railways, after 3 weeks, the properties of this disease, if after 3 weeks migrants are not showing any signs of, reporting for COVID and so on, then they should have let it go then as well. They left it till almost May, so it was inordinate kind of delay. In this, it's not just the fault of the central government, it's also the fault of many state governments who are the who are the sending sites of migration. So what happened was that the governments of Bihar, Odisha, for example, they said that, because so this is like competitive federalism, everyone wanted to show a clean slate. So because there are some migrants come, some cases can go up, and then your nobody wants to show cases going up. So this was also a sad part because there was complete breakdown in coordination. So suddenly you had Maharashtra saying, or Gujarat saying, no, please take that the migrant because it's a headache for us also. And the sort of, sending states saying nothing doing. Right? So this was also a major problem in this particular saga. And I think you need a better interstate coordination going forward. So let the migrants go back and have better interstate coordination. And let's not think in terms of whose cases are going up. In the event, what it turns out is that the migrants who went back home in Bihar, it is not the case that the districts which send out the most migrants actually saw the cases going up. It's in fact converse for whatever reason. So the initial threat also, on hindsight, it's not the case that migrants actually took back the virus. Only in Odisha, Ganjam district has seen cases go up, but Ganjam is exceptionally, within Odisha, it sends a disproportionately large number. So that was kind of expected. So I think a lot of failures, hopefully a lot of learning, and it's really unfortunate because it was just a chaotic experience. And you're right that it's an unnecessary crisis. And while other countries had one health crisis, we were tackling two. And the fact that so many, there were, by the government's admission, something like 20,000 camps of 500,000 people stranded, but kind of come up. This is the worst thing possible in a pandemic. The one thing you want to do in the pandemic is ensure nutrition for all, is to ensure that people are not actually in congested sites, and so on. In fact, that's another argument for letting people go back home, is because you're decongesting cities, which is useful.
Right. Thanks for that. Like when we're talking of migrants and of people returning, I think when we look at different groups within migrants as well, and we see that there is a difference even within the groups as to the treatment that is meted out to them or the issues that they face. So I think if we look at women and migration, that is the area that I'm looking, even in terms of the COVID crisis, but also outside of that, when we're looking at women migrants and particularly the circular migrants that we're talking of, what are the specific issues or what is the discrimination that they face, which is unique to women? We know of the basics of having a lesser wage paid is something that's across the country, across sectors, right? Females get paid less than men on average. So that, barring that, what are specific things you've seen, and in the context of the research you did for your book as well, what are certain issues you saw there?
I think the number one issue, you're right about wages and so on, which is long-standing. I think the number one issue in terms of migration is housing. Right? That is, so let's talk about women's migration. First, of course, is just most Indian women are migrants. As simple as that. That's because of marriage. People move across village boundaries to town. So there are census reports more than 300 million women migrants. In talk of work specifically, of course, many people are getting married and then working. So they're also working. But if you look at single women migration, right, which historically was low, but that's now picking up. And there's certain states like Chhattisgarh and so on, which is sending a lot of people outside today. What are the problems? I'll talk about single woman migration first. This is migration typically in the age group of 20 to 25. And they're going to textile hubs in South India, in Bangalore, for example. Tirupur is completely female dominated. So the particular sectors, like in China, Bangladesh also, government sector has absorbed a lot of women. So and I would say the number one problem in India out there is housing. And that is, there is simply no housing, not enough housing stock to accommodate, especially single women. So in China, for example, they have these huge dormitories, which have kind of absorbed this migrant influx to cities. In India, we've simply fallen short of providing housing, rental housing for everyone, men or women, but especially women. And I don't know the exact numbers, but when I was in Hyderabad, we found that there's virtually nothing available for women migrants. So that's a chicken and egg effect. We say that there are not enough women migrating, like on these terms. But if they migrate, where should they stay? So this is the fundamental problem. And the solution, of course, is to let the market create or incentivize the rental market to create a lot of housing for single women. This ties up with the more general point about safety. Right? And so a lot of women, if you ask even men who migrate and do not get their wives to the city, which I would argue is the dominant form of migration in India, male-dominated circular migration. A lot of them will say, the city is not safe for the woman. Right? So even if we get her, two things, it's not safe, and what she will do. Right? So that ties into a much larger question, migrant or not, about lack of opportunities for work in cities for women, safety issues. But I would say at a more basic level for this 20 to 25 age group, just getting better housing options is vital. And one of the reasons that's not happening is because the landlords, so to speak, are usually men. So they've never really thought of this as a major sort of problem. So you need more women entrepreneurs actually to set this up. So these are kind of women networks, all women networks are developed, and one needs some push, in this sector to make it this thing. The other part is, of course, in terms of portability of social security. Maybe we'll talk about in a different context. But again, women, when you move out a ration card, losing access to that ration card is a big deal. So women are shortchanged there. And the last part is about public health, right? That is, when we talk about portability of social security, most of the discussion has been on PDS. But what we don't realize is the loss of access to the Anganwadi. Right? So this is huge. If you're moving from the village to the city, you simply don't have access to the local, ASHA workers and so on. Closely associated with this, so health takes a beating. You'll be surprised to know a lot of women actually go back just for health treatment. So you would think that cities offer better health to people in general, and I think that's true. But a lot of women actually prefer to go back to the villages, even if it's worse quality, because it's cheaper. Right? And so this is something that studies are finding now on gender migration, that women are completely locked out of the health systems, and that's very important because public health is hugely important for women. Then there's also the construction sector, which is more specific, and work which shows so then it's about tasks. It's about very, very high intensive manual labor, which kind of affects the woman's health. So that is also a very serious issue, and that is a very important issue because that affects the next generation. Because pregnant mothers work on construction sites, and so it's an intergenerational transmission of undernutrition. So housing and the lack of access to health, I think these are the two main.
If we dive a little deeper into this, what have you seen as, or what are your suggestions on practically possible solutions for this? So अभी हमने मतलब एक चीज जो देखी कि one nation one ration, right? So the one nation one ration card theory at least is being floated. Again, implementation pending. But ऐसी और क्या चीजें हो सकती है जिससे particularly governments क्या कर सकते हैं या other CSOs, NGOs who are working in the field वो क्या कर सकते हैं for this?
I think really push for portability of social security across the board. So one nation one ration is basically what PDS, right? So you basically access to subsidized food. But health, I think portability of health, for example, you can access a cheap or free health facility anywhere in India. That would be even more powerful than PDS, and that should be fairly simple. I mean, it's the operational difficulties about interstate coordination. That is really the only thing. And why should the receiving states or the host states be paying for the receiving state? So there has to be a fiscal framework to sort out these issues. But the dream is to access any policy, any welfare policy in India, anywhere in India, irrespective of your domicile. So that's one. So how do you do that practically? You probably need a health card, or you have one card which kind of integrates it across the board, and you can access it anywhere. And since a lot of it has been digitized, the more I'm talking to people who work in this space, the operational feasibility is not. It's very simple. It's just about the will to do it. So one nation, one ration is a good scheme, but it has to still come into play in a major way. It also has to be publicized. Some states have been running this and nobody knows about it. So it has to be publicized in a major way. That's I think portability is number one. Now the concern for a lot of NGOs and a lot of activists working in the ground is, of course, the Aadhaar card. So a lot of people who are anti-Aadhaar card basically say that this is just another way of. So there's a real threat of data collection systems in place and so on. I'm I mean, I don't really have a position on that, but I'm okay with the Aadhaar card being used if it enables meaningful voting in social security. And the fact that now really virtually everyone has an Aadhaar card means that it's going to be very commonsensical to use it to solve these sort of issues. So that is one issue, because I think with the Aadhaar card it becomes reasonably simple. But there are, of course, important issues about data. What we've seen, for example, in the recent crisis, just the names of so many migrant workers floating around in Excel sheets with their phone numbers and everything in the name of relief and help, which was quite disconcerting. So that is definitely. Beyond that, I think what the crisis has done is one thing was just about empathy and attention. That is, we simply don't know enough about migrants. I think that hopefully now will change, because for the first time this invisible workforce has come in the mainstream. Uh, there are small, as I said, this stuff one can do in housing and so on. I think cities, I mean, if you're talking about migration, a lot of it is rural to urban migration. The migrant really doesn't engage with the city that much. Right? So a lot of these migrants are coming to cities, working hard, saving, sending money back, and eventually going back. And one of the reasons is cities themselves seem to be quite hostile. Right? I do think, I mean, this is that it's important to also ensure that migrants get to vote in the places that they go to. Right? And so there has to be a movement of voting. That is one of the reasons why migrants don't have a voice, is there's zero political voice. So typically they vote back in the source. So Bihar will say, come for the elections for people in Delhi and so on. But apart from that, there's no voice. And I've lived now in different parts of India. I have voted everywhere, and I'll tell you, it is so simple to register as a voter in India. It's online in many states. It takes literally a few days to get a voter ID card, and you can So I voted in the municipal election in Hyderabad. I voted across in different elections, and this is completely unknown. I mean, most people think it's a very painful job to actually enroll yourself and get yourself. So ensuring that a huge part of the city actually votes, because then the accountability comes. Then the local guy is going to care about your housing. Local guys, because right now there's absolutely no incentive for anybody to look after this huge floating population. Look at Surat. Surat had this massive protest and so on in April. I mean, most of those guys don't vote, and this is a huge part of the city. So who's going to? There's zero incentive for anybody, irrespective of political party, to actually give these guys any amenity. So I think raising the voice to get political inclusion. One is financial inclusion, housing inclusion. Political inclusion is also important.
Right. We had a couple of questions from the people who registered as well, so I'll take some of those. A question from Sri Ganesh sir is that, what are your views on Interstate Migrant Workmen Regulation of Employment and Conditions of Service Act, which came out in 1979?
So broadly put, just like any of our organized sector labor laws, it came about at a point, I mean, I'll give you the historical background to that. A huge part of the rationale for that came in the context of bonded labor. That is bonded, there's a whole act on bonded labor abolition and so on. And so it came from this particular thing of stopping trafficking. Now, I would argue, I mean, trafficking does happen in India, but the bulk of work-related migration is not trafficking. The bulk of work-related migration in India is not through contractors. Right? And so once you understand this, then in real terms, the Interstate Workmen Act applies to very few people. So that is one thing. This is not to belittle it, but it is just to state the reality that it affects a really tiny percentage of India's migrants. Because just like trade union laws and all, I mean, just a small part of Indian workforce is organized. So a huge part of those social security laws don't apply to India's workforce. Again, this is not to belittle it. Now, are they issues? So what is the act about? It's basically contractors and employers have to register workers with the state and so on. Now that's useful, but it's a cost. When you look at from the point of view of the firms, it's a huge compliance cost, and it gives rise to an unnecessary license charge in this particular space. And a lot of this is in very exploitative sectors like brick-in and so on. But I would say this act is usually applicable to the construction industry. I would rather have the construction industry associations, and there's already a construction cess fund which construction companies have to pay into and so on. Though that money is hardly used, for the welfare of construction workers. And one of the reasons there is that workers are not registered or continuously registered. So we've been talking to construction company lobbies and so on, and I'm more keen that construction companies themselves pressure the governments to use the money that they have paid into. I mean, demand accountability of the government of using that money constructively for migrant workers, rather than this very roundabout route of the Interstate Working Act. If you see how many cases have been registered under that act, it's negligible. So as it stands, the thing has very little bite. The law, it is rarely been invoked, and it's literally just it's coming from a place of very good intentions of the 1970s, which was high point of labor movements in India. But in practical terms, I'm afraid that there's very little one can say about it today. I think and in general, I'm more in favor of a sort of a direct payout to workers. Either the government just gives money, or the government or uses construction board money, rather than this very roundabout. And the more the registration, the more the problems. That is an unfortunate reality. It becomes very bureaucratic. So mixed views. Let me just say I have mixed views on this. That is, you would expect most people who work on migration to say that yes, this has to be enforced and so on. But working on the ground, it's not a binding constraint. That is, even if you make this law better or stronger, most people are going to skirt it. And I think the fundamental reason is that it leads to more bureaucracy and red tape. So I'm saying if the objective is to protect the rights and dignity of migrant workers in brick-in, in construction and so on, I think the emphasis has to move towards what the employers are directly doing for the employees. I think that is a better way of looking at it. There is a important thing about the contractors, and what this crisis has shown as the contractors have disappeared. So a lot of places migrants were stranded because the contractors just disappeared and said, okay, to help with you, and we are not going to do anything. So now that is very tricky, and that is why I've been talking to construction companies saying you have to really directly engage with workers. This outsourcing model, it might be useful in terms of costs, but in many cases you simply don't know who's your end employer. So yeah, so that's broadly what I think.
Great. Yeah, there was a follow-up question from Rajita on the topic of housing that you mentioned. So she says more and more reports speak of consistent increase in vacant houses over the years. Technically, there are houses, but they're just not accessible. So how do you think we can find a way around this?
Yeah, that's a good point. But the vacant houses are not 1 BHKs, they're 3 BHKs. That's the basic problem, right? So we have an oversupply of housing in the elite sort of market, but we have an undersupply of housing in the low income housing. So you're right that yes, I mean, there are something like, I don't know, millions of vacant houses in India, but they're at I mean, you can't just say, let's just convert that, because that's at a very different price point, and no builder or real estate person is going to sell that. And the reality is that people have enormous staying power. They can live on unsold inventory for years, right? So all that means is that one should not be looking at this vacant house phenomenon in order to convert, because that's impossible. What one needs to do is basically activate the market at the low income space. Historically, two options were tried out. One is public housing. That has worked maybe in Calcutta to some extent, but broadly it has been a failure. So if you look at the history of supplying housing in India, I'm again more in favor of just activating housing in the private sector itself. Now, unfortunately, the fact is that real estate markets in India are heavily regulated by land ceiling acts and just a variety of laws, which have seriously constrained both housing and rental housing. That's also important. Our entire focus on housing so far has been home ownership, and most of the migrants don't want home ownership; they want rental housing. So when it comes to housing, how does one activate rental housing? One is, a lot of the rental laws are very, again, they came from this very nice benevolent sort of idea, rent control acts and so on. Rent control acts are the short way to destroy a rental housing market. Right? So any good economic contract has to, it cannot skew bargaining power in one way or the other extreme. So what the Rent Control Act said was it gave complete control to the tenant. Right? So you can't chuck out a tenant, you can't, and what you saw was nobody willing to let out, right? And nobody willing to invest in the maintenance of the building. So one of the reasons why buildings in our cities are so badly maintained is precisely because of a lot of these reasons. So the Rent Control Act should, wherever it's gone in most places, but it should definitely go. I think just this idea of pushing, there is now a national policy on rental housing. It's a draft, as far as I can see. But that really has to, come out to play in a much larger way. For example, look at China, which has successfully moved out hundreds of millions of people from farming to manufacturing and so on. They've been able to do that because of massive housing in cities. In fact, now when you talk about vacant housing, they actually have a problem of vacant housing at the low income scene, right? Because now they have these ghost towns, so they kind of oversupply. Okay, so that is a different. But I would say that's a better problem to have than our problem of undersupply. So I mean obviously you don't want ghost towns and so on, but I would just say that China has managed this massive migration in a much more better way than India, and the housing is a huge part of that success story. And we've just simply not been able to get our housing right. There is also a problem of information. When migrants come to cities, how do you know where do you want to stay? And most migrants want to stay with people they're coming from. So migrants are often locked into places simply because they don't know. They don't know about decent housing options, which may be in other places. So how to provide more information to migrants is also, because you have to understand migration is highly networked. All the information about jobs, everything, accommodation is coming from a particular family network, caste network. So how to break out of that is also important.
A point you just mentioned about China, about the farmers moving from farming to migration to manufacturing, that just brings me to a question which is around the farmers in our country, right? So a lot of our migrants are farmers for half the year, circular migrants, and then they migrate out because they don't have anything to do in the remaining half of the year. So if you're looking at the kharif crop, and the season right now is, they'll be coming back home for that as well. So what are your views around this, or what can be done to make farming in itself more of a viable and sustainable option, such that they don't need to move out?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be an unpopular opinion, but the way I see it, farming will become viable when there are less people there. Let's in a simple sense, what economists talk about surplus labor. That is, one should not see migration as a problem which needs to be checked, and hence, if people stay back in villages, then more people. In fact, farming will become much more viable if more people leave farming. I mean, I don't know if this is making sense to you. That is why, in China also the farmers are much better off today than earlier, because there is less pressure of the labor, because that labor has moved to other places. Of course, there they had manufacturing to absorb. You're absolutely right that India, we've not managed to do that, so we're stuck at both ends. But very simply put, this relationship between migration and agriculture, the data is very mixed on this. In the sense, the agriculturally most fertile parts of India, coastal Andhra, for example, if you go to coastal Andhra, it's beautiful valleys and it's mind-boggling. Or, for example, rural Punjab, which today has problems, but earlier, historically very rich. Did it stop migration in these places? No. There was mass migration, not mass, but substantial migration. But that's a migration which is very useful or very good in migration studies, because that's a migration of prosperity. So the model there is you make a lot of money in agriculture, and then what do? You invest in your child's education, and no child who's educated, beyond class 12, or I would say a college education, is actually going to work in agriculture. That's a reality. Right? So this is what the simple reason being agriculture. What I mean by agriculture is actually on the farm. So nobody's going to do backbreaking work on farms. The the minute you got a graduate degree. So you might own the land, you might make it a farmhouse, you might continuously go back, but you're not actually the farmer. So that's a big difference. And so this is the model of Punjab and coastal Andhra, where people started moving to the towns, then they started moving to big cities like Hyderabad in the Andhra, and then of course finally abroad. So from Punjab, people went to Canada. There also they're working in farming, by the way, but it's at a higher sort of wage. And from coastal Andhra, people have gone to the US and so on. So that's one. So that we should call it as the migration for prosperity. But note, it's not that with all that agricultural prosperity, people stayed there. People still moved. Vis-a-vis a place like Vidarbha, right, which has these farmer suicides and a lot of issues in agriculture, where also people are migrating. But that's more of a distress kind of migration, right? And that is not necessarily leading to upward mobility over time. So there's this distress kind of migration and this prosperity kinds. So ideally, I mean, I'm convinced that we need very few people in farming. More people should migrate and so on. But we need to encourage and ensure that the quality of migration kind of enhances over time. Now, many of times these seasonal migrations, which start off for a few months, which are very exploited, graduate to longer streams. People build networks in cities, and over time there is upward mobility even there. And as I write in my book, Udupi, for example, so like I give you the example of Andhra and Punjab. Udupi is a district in Karnataka, and Saran is a district in Bihar. Both of them have had mass male out migration for more than 100 years. But Udupi is one of the richest districts of India, and Saran is not. And that's because what the migrants themselves have done to invest in education, invest in agriculture matters. Now, migration can also be useful for agriculture because the remittances can potentially be invested in agriculture. Does that happen? Not really. So in remittance economies, what we see is that land does not become very important for agriculture. Land is more of a status. So very few people actually sell their land in India, in rural areas. So it's a huge attachment to land. Just as I said, people want to die back in the villages. You want to hold on to the land that if you do own land. And so, in what we find in remittance economies, some people, of course, use the money coming from migration to invest in land. But a lot of the times, the land is just there for like making a small crop. You don't want to do too much, activities in agriculture because you're living comfortably off remittance income. So remittance income is a double-edged sword. It can, on the one hand, spur investment if it is channeled well, and that is why I think smart remittance economies channel this money well into agriculture. But it can very quickly lead to an addiction to remittance income, whereby you really don't do much in agriculture because you're anyway comfortable from this money coming on. So brought it to this question of what I mean. I would say I'll say the best way to support agriculture in India is to ensure that people have jobs in cities. It's literally that, because the numbers are very stark. If you look at density, for example, India has some of the densest rural tracts of the world. And cities are dense by definition, but in rural areas, if you go to Bihar, UP, I mean, they're like village sizes which are more than 10,000 and so on. It is not agriculture. People say, it should be viable and so on. But it would be viable only if on a per kilometer basis, there are fewer people actually. The other alternative is not migration, but a rural non-farm economy. And in India, the reality is that more than migration, rural areas are diversifying into the rural non-farm economy. So this is the entire services sector, mobile repair shops, and just trading shops, which are sprouting up. So that, yes, I mean, I think that is a much more viable opportunity than farming in many ways. And the reality is that ideally, I would like to see more migration to cities because that is the classic model of development. But in India, actually, we find that more villages have this diversification into the non-farm sector and migration. That is actually what is happening based on whatever data we are seeing.
Yeah. And that's a very interesting, probably controversial idea, as you mentioned, of reducing the number of farmers to actually make the quality of that better.
This is how economists talk, very harsh people. But no, this reducing is not by killing. That is unfortunately what also happens in India because of suicides and so on. Reducing meaning a transfer of surplus labor, which is a classic. If you look at the history of virtually, I can't think of a single place this is the most empirically, a generalizable rule in development. Right? That is, as people get rich, they move away from agriculture. And it's very simple. You look at our own wallets. When we were in college, I remember, I used to spend about a third of my pocket money on food. Today, with my income, it's a tiny fraction that goes to food. Right? And so as we get richer, we spend less on food. And so that is why if you're stuck producing that food, you're not going to get any money. Right? So even when you go to a restaurant, if you pay for a 500 rupee meal, the food content is a very small part. You're paying for the service. Right? And so that is why it's services, it's manufacturing, which appropriates the bulk of the value. So if you're stuck in the producing part, you're not going to get any money.
Right. Another question that we have from Tarun is that what are the political economy challenges to securing voting rights for migrants in their destination sites? Why aren't opposition parties mobilizing these marginal votes? Because given that they benefit more from more than the incumbent from increase in the voting share.
It's a good point. One is it's very clustered. So when migrants stay in cities, it's very clustered, right? So it's not the case that all the wards of a city will have the same proportion of migrants. So typically it's literally, a few wards which have a lot of migrants. And in those wards, politicians do try and get the migrants registered and so on. So unfortunately, because of this reason, if you take a city with 100 wards and it's only 5 wards where migrants actually make up, say, 30% of the population, then it still doesn't matter because 95 wards, you don't really have to engage. So as a political class, there's very few incentives actually. So it's not, migrants are a huge percentage of cities, but because of the clustered nature of living, it directly affects only a few wards. And so the political economy challenge is how to make migration or get migrants into the political arena, despite no incentive for politicians to actually engage. And so that is the really tricky part. So what happens in these wards with massive migrant populations? There is of course competition, the political sort of competition in trying to get the votes, but the source region is still seen as the ultimate home, right? And so I'm sure many people out here are migrants who have voted in India who are watching this. I don't know how many of you all have actually taken the effort to change your voting card from your source region, from your destination. So how do you expect a migrant worker working in a manufacturing cluster to do the same? But I should tell you, you should do it. I mean, instead of talking about migrant workers, all of us should be voting wherever we are in municipal elections as well. And so, I was thrilled. About 5 years back when I voted in Hyderabad municipal election, I couldn't believe how simple it was. The whole process was remarkably simple. So this is one thing about migrants, but we are all migrants, and so or most of us. And so, my thing is that in general, voting, let's call it this democratic imperative that voting itself should be encouraged before each election. Maybe you have some simple drives before every election, and this is not state elections; this is municipal elections that matter, because that's where really the nuts and bolts of day-to-day necessities are sort of dealt with. So it's a tough question. I don't have any simple answer. How do you get people to vote and so on? But if one is working in this arena of political economy or this thing, it's a classic question, and it would be great to have out-of-the-box solutions to this. One is to understand how I know it's fairly simple to get your voting card changed, but just think about it. Somebody comes and tells you that vote for me in the municipal elections, and then you say, okay, I have to go, but change it from my state, and then the state government is saying, please vote for us back home. So this is the classic dilemma, right? Because the circular migrant is eventually going to retire back home. So there's zero incentive to actually get the voting card change. So a really out-of-the-box solution would be, can municipal elections, the voting in municipal elections, can that have a completely different system in terms of the registration? That is, why should the Election Commission of India, right now, you're in one location when you vote. So, okay, state and center agreed that you need a particular card. But for municipal elections, let's make it like just purely resident-based. That is, if you're living there, it doesn't matter. So that would be a completely out-of-the-box solution. That is, and I have also voted in London. Can you get that? Right? So when I was studying in London, you can vote as a resident of London, as an international student in London. You can vote in the London elections. So I'm not a citizen of UK, but I could vote in London. So you can get a resident. I think that would be really cool if you can get a resident-based voting system in cities.
Right. Just connected to that, there was a question which says that, is working with election commissions then a long-term solution, a possible long-term solution to addressing concerns for migrants? Because voting lists are not often updated, full of errors, omissions, etc. So could
Absolutely.
that be?
Absolutely. I think, and this is, by the way, see, migration is a well-studied topic in India in many dimensions, but politics is not. Very little work done at the interface of migrants' voting choices, how migrants vote, or how they're debarred from voting. This is a very exciting area actually for somebody to work on. And you're absolutely right that one can potentially work with election officers know this. I mean, this is India's. I think there have been some articles written on India's missing voters and so on. I mean, this is what this is about. And I'm sure that if one starts up at a local level and just tries and understands what is the percentage of a population which is not voting, it is huge. Like think about it, a municipal election in Bangalore. Bangalore is a huge IT hub with more than 50% of migrants coming from outside, from other cities. So it's not even rural to urban migration; it's urban to urban migration. I don't think anybody votes in the municipal election. So if you take the Bangalore's population of now 10 million and just take the voter registration list, you're going to get voter turnout rates. See, voter turnout rates are basically how many people who vote based on the list. But if you take the denominator as the eligible population of Bangalore, I think that's going to be a tiny number. It's as if nobody in Bangalore is voting, right? Because nobody is actually on that list in the first place. So yes, I mean, one needs to have. I mean, this is a long-run process. You'll need like amendments and change the system and so on. So these are not short-term solutions. But I think this is something one can think about. In the end, I am all for greater autonomy for cities. I think fundamentally our cities are flawed because there's simply zero autonomy in financing. So city governments have continuously go to state governments, and there is despite this 73rd, 74th amendments and so on, a very little functional autonomy. So, and I think that change really has to come from the center. That is literally like how you have these manifestos of BJP has a manifesto, Article 370 and so on. Somebody should have a manifesto saying just open up our cities, literally make them independent and where residents can vote. I think that would be a really powerful step to empower cities. But of course, it is not going to happen. We know that also. So, but hope wishful
Optimistic.
Wishful thinking. No, I mean, see, it's all the makers of the decentralization governance amendments. The 73rd, 74th, right? That came about after literally 30 years of debate. So I never discount the value of discussions and debate because it's ideas like this. Somebody then goes into government. So it's always useful to talk about ideas because you never know who is in a position to actually make a difference. And sometimes these ideas stick on. And so those, in my view, those were huge decisions which happened in the early 90s. And I think what we see in India's development story since then, you might agree or disagree with how well India has done. But that decentralization in the villages where it happened meaningfully played a huge part. And it's usually not, usually people say liberalization and so on. But in my view, it's really that Panchayati Raj institution which really empowered a lot of villages in India and so on. But cities, unfortunately, that other amendment has not been enforced to such a great extent. And a lot of the basic provisions of those amendments are still not done by many. I mean, to give you a simple example, we still don't know if I want to do a study on city level finances. There is no data. There's absolutely no database on urban finances in India, which you would think is the most basic thing to start just some city level analysis on. So that's another issue that is the urban governance, and all of this is supposed to happen with that amendment. There is also this thing about converting large settlements to cities. So how does a Gram Panchayat become a Nagar Panchayat, for example? And in India, the whole incentive is to never let this happen. because the minute this happens, you lose access to Manrega, because Manrega is rural employment guarantee. You lose. So our whole political economy or social sector of welfare benefits is skewed in favor of rural areas. So we now have this bizarre thing where you have settlement sizes of 30,000 people, which are still classified as villages. So that is another issue, and that is of the governance of settlement sizes, and that is why we need to start thinking more in terms of the overall bias of all of this that we talk about comes from an old bias of this Gandhian sort of ideal of India's village republics. So one thing that comes out from there is, if you do enough for villages, nobody will have to migrate. Right? So this is one of those philosophies, which I would say is completely nonsense. Right? In fact, more villages develop, more people leave. Right? That's what we've been seeing in India. Second, that welfare policies should be more towards villages, because that's where it's more needed. Another argument is that if you divide it better between rural and urban, people will move and also get the benefits in urban areas. If you look at the funding between the Ministry of Rural Development and Ministry of Urban Development, right? It's not the best thing to do, but that ratio of funding is more than 90:10. That is, the Rural Development Ministry gets much more than the Urban Development Ministry. Now you might argue that but the other ministries which flow into urban areas, fair enough. But this ratio is still hugely in favor of rural areas, right? Whereas the actual numbers are 7:3. That is, India's 30% urban, well, as per some definition, census definition. So you would expect this ratio to be 7:3, 7 for rural and 3 for urban. But it's actually more than 9 for rural and less. And the flip side is we have underinvested in our cities. So people say we're not doing anything for villages. There's an urban bias. All the policymakers are sitting in cities. But the fact is that's where people eventually end up in any country. And so it makes more sense to sort of anticipate that and invest in cities.
I think a question very connected to that was that from Mayur is that urbanization is inevitable and important for economic growth, and people will have to move where jobs are rather than the other way around, right? And given that 80% of our workforce is in the informal sector, only the formal sector are able to provide welfare. So what are barriers for formalization of enterprise as well as labor? And an example he just states is that the entitlements for BOCW workers, right? So there, it's a lack of formalization that leads to them not having those entitlements.
True. That's the $1 million question in India about how to formalize. A lot of people have said that this is happening and all. I don't think it's happening. I think there are two ends, and again, an unpopular opinion. A lot of the literature has been a very labor-centric argument of exploitation. It is, people are in informal contracts because this is the best way to exploit labor. My sense is somewhat different. There is a huge preference in India on both ends, on the side of labor and employers, to keep contracts informal. Let me tell you how this might work. So, for example, the circular migrant worker. Right? The person comes to the city, but ideally, the dream job or the dream contract is where there is no fixed contract, where I don't have to come to work every day. If there's something happening back home, I can go back anytime without taking leave and so on. So that flexibility, which a lot of people decry about, is actually a huge boon also for the circular migrant. Right? And the employers, of course, want flexibility for keeping costs low and skirting all these laws and so on. But it's a mistake. The reason I believe in India is so informal is that there is preference on both ends. It's not a one-way exploitation stream. There's a preference at both ends of the system. So how does one change this? It's obviously tricky, but I think the way again, legislation is one classic way. Okay, so everyone should get certain things. The more I've been thinking about this is a topic I've been thinking for more than a decade now. The more I think about this, I feel it's easier if the government directly steps in and gives a basic income. That I think that's just a much simpler way. I was against basic income many years back, but I think this is now. The more I think about it, it makes more sense. Everyone should have a basic income, right? And so let people do whatever they want to do with that basic starting point, right? And that should come from the government side. And the employers should really be focusing on maintaining basic laws in terms of labor rights and so on, but should not be, the employer should not be pressed too much on providing a lot of the social security aspects, right? And because workers themselves don't mind switching between employers and so on, and it's a huge hassle. The more the welfare thing that the employer has to give, the less the employer is going to do. That is what we actually see. And so one benevolent idea is, let the employer basically provide for all, like the sort of my buff of the employee, but that doesn't happen. So I think it's probably better to have the government as the ultimate patron of many of these migrant workers than the employer. Now, if you come to that point, then it means that you have a larger welfare state, and I think in this crisis, there is a remarkable consensus across economists of all ideologies that the government has to spend much more, and the government is not, right. So the government right now is spending, partly because there's no money in the government's coffers. Coming to your question, if the question is how to formalize and so on, the whole idea of formalization is social security. That's a huge part of what we mean by formal. Right? And I feel let the government do it. Let the government let's be a welfare state where the government offers us massive social security, much more than what it's doing right now. And because you have to understand, the bulk of the employers are small scale guys, MSMEs and so on, and they are anyway burdened with a ton of laws. And one more set of laws, on particular grounds, is there's a serious, enforcement cost which seems to be imposed. So unpopular opinion again, because most people working on labor would say, this has to be, it's like a tick mark box, like you have to have PF, PPF, this, that, all of this should come from the employer. But the point is actually employees. When I have talked with migrant workers, this is not really on the top of their mind. The top of the mind is to get a basic income more than anything else, right? And the whole strategy is to get that income. The whole strategy is also to be flexible. That is, you don't mind switching employers as long as you're getting a secure job and so on. So tough question. Obviously, if it was an easy question, we would be a formalized country by now. But I think that what I want to emphasize is a lot of people think that this is a simple thing, but employers are being exploited, and this is a problem. I think in India there is a genuine issue also on the side of labor, which prefers informal contracts. So when I've said this in various forums, people say, "Oh, this is just an apology for exploitation and so on." But I don't think so. It's my view that and when you talk to migrant workers in particular, you'll see that people say that people many times have left so-called formal jobs to be in the informal space where you live life on your terms, that sort of thing. So informal is also seen as ability to live your life on your terms, because in the formal setup you also have to report to work as per a particular schedule, as per a particular routinized sort of life. Whereas in the informal sector, a lot of informal sector by the way is just self-employment, right? So that is also informal labor. In fact, in urban areas, something like 30% of jobs are self-employment. So it's a very tricky issue. But my answer would be that the government has to step in and provide the bulk of the social security directly. And I think in that sense, this UBI concept, is quite appealing, right? Especially the fact that this year we are in a recession. So India, we're getting poorer this year, however you look at it, on average. So some major fiscal stimulus has to be.
Yeah, it's definitely the part of the flexibility does make sense, but I don't think even I am very convinced of the idea that the informal sector is a pull from both ends. It could also be an issue of awareness of their rights for the labor themselves. What are the benefits that they could get by being in the formal sector? So what are they entitled to? So I think that gap of awareness has a huge role to play, because they can only see select parts of the picture.
Could be, but I'll just give this classic example of Kerala. Kerala has the best labor laws in India, best labor rights, everything. Right? A quarter of the labor force does not work in Kerala. Right? They work in fairly exploitative, so-called exploitative conditions in the Gulf. Right? And you have to think, why is it that people leave God's own country, the best labor laws in the world, to go and work and get exploited in the Gulf? And my answer is that people care about the absolute level of income more than anything else. Right? And so it's an interesting way to look at this particular question, because I mean a lot of people who talk about the Kerala model, I mean it has fantastic things going for it, but the fact is that it has not provided jobs for a quarter of its labor force, or rather it is a remittance economy. There's no difference between Kerala and Bihar when it comes to being a remittance economy. They're both getting a huge part of their money from outside. So ensuring all these things is no guarantee of keeping your people there again.
Right. I think that this could be an ongoing conversation which could go much longer. But we're at 5 o'clock. We have a couple of other questions as well. We could either send them out to you, with them, and reply back to these people, or take them right now, whatever.
Yeah, take it right now.
Okay, sure. So they're just so we have one question from Prachi. She says that what role do you think the gig economy will play in dictating migration trends in India?
Yeah, in two parts to that. One is in this COVID kind of world. I don't know if that's the question. That is, how will the gig economy itself be changed by this COVID? So that I don't know how long this will last and so on. So that's a part. But in general, the gig economy, I mean, a huge part of the gig economy, there's a huge market which is of course created by delivery services, which employs migrants. So that's a huge employment creating sector, which is of course now massively hit because everyone's going to work. I mean, if you work from home, that's fine because you still want delivery. But with this COVID, obviously, things are quite bad. How does the gig economy affect migration? Very simply put, I mean, the general thrust of it would be positive in the sense of greater demand for migrant labor. I think that's broadly how I would see it, and that's coming from a particular range of services that the gig economy requires, which is well provided for by migrant workers. I think that's how I see it. And if you have any particular sectors in mind that I can maybe answer better. But otherwise, I think the broader the question, the vaguer the answer. So yeah.
Sure. I think Prachi, if you have a specific question, you could send it to Professor Tumbe. I think the other question that we have from Anita is more to do with when governments are largely parceling out welfare measures. What are your thoughts on making the government accountable?
Yeah, but the government is accountable in the sense that the government is is elected, and India does throw out governments which have not performed. So I don't. I don't buy this argument that in India, there's zero accountability and so on. There is some accountability. Of course, now the government has ways to evade accountability. But as compared to a variety of stakeholders, including us, like I would say I have zero accountability. I can get away by doing practically anything. But the governments cannot, because we have a system of elections and so on. So now accountability on public spending per se, this is a tricky year because, as I said, there's virtually no tax revenues. But otherwise, if you see India, I mean, a lot of people say, neoliberal India, this, that. But the reality is that we are a bigger welfare state today than we were in 1990. So if you look at government spending on almost any dimension, and what is unfortunately reduced is investment in agriculture and so on, which is bad, public investment in agriculture. But if you look at just the amount of welfare spending in India as a proportion of GDP, it's almost at a record high in our last 70 years, and it has consistently increased. I mean, just think of the Manrega as a massive step up. So the government, I think, in a broader scheme of things, if you take a 30-year perspective, has been accountable. It has responded to these demands of people. You would not have got Manrega out of nowhere. It came about from a people's movement. It came about from a lot of research, almost 10 years of thinking that went, I would say 30 years, but made 10-year core focus to get a law like Manrega, which is in my view a very good law to provide basic income throughout the year, or at least something. So while it's easy to disaccount, I think in India at some level accountability still exists. And of course, one has to demand. There's no going on the fact that we need to have more accountability. But I don't believe in this idea that politicians are accountable to nobody. I think politicians do pay an electoral cost price when they don't do anything.
All right. I mean, yeah, that's another point where I feel there can be a lot of back and forth, and if we could have a discussion around the point of accountability of who's accountable for what exactly, and whether that is a generalized accountability that exists somewhere instead of posts or people being specifically held accountable, which is why I think the 10 or 30 years that it does take for something to come about, is that then justified, or that timing as well?
Yeah, I mean, you could make it like take the migration crisis. No heads have been rolled in the migration crisis because who is supposed to be? I mean, you can't.
Yeah.
I mean, the prime minister has taken a decision. You can't ask the prime minister to resign. I mean, at least I would not in that sense because of a particular decision like that. But note that in China, so I would say China, despite its autocratic credentials, has a very strange accountability system in place. So in this whole COVID thing, some guys, and initially there was a massive cover up and bungling and so on. Some guys were asked to leave, as simple as that. So in India, maybe we don't. If the point is, are we not seeing enough of that? I don't have the numbers. Unfortunately, again, that's another thing. But I think people are kept on their toes. If you see what's happening in state elections, people fraud governments regularly. So I think that keeps people on. Academics are the least accountable. So we don't have to be accountable. We can say anything, give policy advice, talk like these in webinars, and have absolutely zero accountability.
Yeah, I think no comments on that. But the last, I think, question/comment that we have from Sri Ganesh sir is one was talking about worker registration, which is, can it be similar to the CDC of the shipping industries? So we know how many people there are in each vocation. And another point he's mentioned is about the voter ID cards. So he says that, it may not, another solution might be to have postal ballots instead of automatic postal ballots instead of the one that we currently have of applying for it, etc. So these are two.
Yeah, the second one is a great question. I've never really thought about it, but I won't answer it because I simply don't know enough. I don't know enough about postal ballots and so on. The first one, what was it? Sorry.
The CDC of the shipping industry. So he said that can they register similar to that?
So again, I'm very wary of this whole registration business. One, the numbers are very large, right? So we're talking of like literally tens of millions of people. Like, the UP chief minister said in this whole thing when the migrants came back saying, now if people want our labor, they'll first have to take our permission. This is all crazy stuff. I mean, you don't want to have an internal passport system in India. That's the last thing we want. We have articles in our constitution which guarantee free movement of people and that's how it should be made. I think registration, so what benefits does registration provide? So one is it gives an identity in the labor market. So Ajivika bureaus and NGO, they work on this. They provide, registration. And so that seems to work. So there seems to be some benefit. But at an overall scale, if the objective is to know, for example, you're absolutely right that one of the things that the migration crisis showed was that we have absolutely no clue actually of how many migrant workers, say from Bihar, are in Maharashtra. Right? In fact, I can tell you, for a month, this is all I was doing. I would get calls from governments saying literally like, kitne aadmi the? How many people are there in this district from our state? It's like ridiculous. My point is, registration is not going to solve that, right? Because this is a labor market so much in flux. You will find people registering one place, then they move to another district, a new job, so that becomes very obsolete. Instead, if you have the system of portable social security, you will see why do you need to know how many people are there in a particular state? It is so that in a crisis, you know how many people to support or something to that effect. Now, if you have this portable social security, automatically those teller points, so to speak, will give you data of how many Biharis are accessing PDS in Mumbai. So that will automatically give you data. So I'm more in favor of systems which automatically give you data on migration rather than forcing them to register. Because again, registration is one of those things which is seemingly very, it's a good thing to do, but it's an additional cost. It's an additional pain point for the migrant. If you think of the migrant workers, point of view, that is, you really want to minimize this one more layer of, and the point is the migrant workers are continuously in flux. Even if you register in one place, those records get obsolete very, very quickly. So if this portability of social security comes out, I think that's a smarter way of knowing at any given point of time, the migrant map of India. Obviously, people are not accessing it, they will be out of the system. But then you want to know only those people who are accessing, because those are the sort of vulnerable. So I think it's registration is maybe it's a good idea, but I think that if the idea is to know how many people are there, I think there are smarter ways to go about it. For example, banks. All these migrants are sending back money from banks, right? So we kind of know, if you want to know, actually, it's all about the government releasing some data. Classic railway data, right? Railway traffic data. If that was released to the public, researchers would know exactly how many migrants are there in every district. Unfortunately, this data is never released. So some of us got some handle of this a few years back. This economic survey chapter we had done 2016-17. There's some analysis of railway data, but otherwise, railway data is simply not there. But that's a classic thing, because so many migrants travel by railways. You would instantly know, important corridors, dense corridors, and that can actually be played up in policy circles. If you know the corridors, then you can also do smart marketing of services on those corridors. So the railway platforms, the trains themselves can be sort of used for information provisions and so on. I'll just end by saying, the railway train in India is really underused as both a site of research and also policy intervention. And a lot of these migrants spend almost a day just traveling in these trains. And a lot of my research during my PhD was just sitting in these general compartments with the migrants, taking these long journeys across India. And just realize people are very receptive to what happens in the trains. So this is just a parting thought about, creative policies which engage with migrants, because typically it's about source and destination, but there is actually also this in-between transit, the railway journey, which is and in which the migrants not doing anything, right? So it's the migrant is most receptive. In fact, a lot of my research happened on the railway platform, because if I was interviewing migrants at the destination, they were too busy because they were at work. If they were at their home, they're too tired. That is in the cities, and in the villages, why should I talk to you? In the sense, I'm back home for the holidays. So it was on the railway platforms and the trains that actually people were most willing to engage with an outsider.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. I think we can close out by just thanking you for being here today, and thank you to the other participants as well. If you'd like to share with us, just very briefly, a story or an anecdote that stuck with you through your research of your PhD journey, for your book, etc.
There are tons. Firstly, thank you for having me over, and I really enjoyed all the questions, which are very, very thought-provoking. And many of the things I've said is to provoke rather than I think a fruitful engagement comes only when you try and have an honest conversation. There are tons of things, and if you read my book, you'll realize the tons of things that have come about. So do read the book. But we're talking of migrants and gender and so on. This thing happened in Surat. I was at a particular unit, textile unit, and it's very interesting because there is this Maharashtrian family, tribal family from Khandesh, which was there with the husband and wife, and the child was not there. The husband and wife, they were working, they were doing tasks out there. And then you have the Bihari migrant, who is the classic single male migrant, who's married, but the wife is back home. So I had in front of me these two classic. There's the married migrant family, where the man and the woman have come to the city. And then there is this Bihari guy who's the prototype male migrant. And as a researcher, this is classic, because at one side you have these two different migration strategies. And so I was in conversation with both of them. And this is a burning question for me is, why is it that, this guy's got his wife along out here? Or alternatively, why she has got, her husband, and why this guy has come along. And it's really interesting, the real cultural difference out here. And the Bihari guy said there's no way he could think of getting his wife this. This is how we do it. And this guy said there's absolutely no way I can think of moving without my wife. And then he taunted this guy, saying that in fact this fellow just got a kid and he's distributing sweets with us. He says, if I had a kid back home, I would be with my kid. And I would be with my family. And that's one instance which really captures these different cultural norms on migration and so on. So that's something which really stuck on with me because this particular tribal belt from northern Maharashtra, you'll rarely see single male migration. So it's not just economics but also culture to some extent, which determines how people migrate.
Awesome. Thanks a lot again.
Cool.
Meera, and yeah. Have a good evening. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.